Hey guys, it's Dreamforce here. You know they say that every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, God kills a Kirin? Well, this is Foreign's channel. And every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, Foreign kills a Seagull.
Okay, this is episode 4 of Watch the Overture with me and Yiska. And for this episode, what we're going to discuss is, okay, so in the history of competitive Overwatch, because there was actually a history before the Overwatch League. I know there was that barren wasteland of about 6 months, it was just online competition. But there were lands, there was Apex, there was obviously a few Western lands. And during this time period, we had the first great teams rise up. And when these teams rise up, one of the things you always want to keep track of in the history of a game is how the great teams fall off. Like, do they just instantly capsize and go down to nothing? Do they gradually work their way down? Is someone able to, I mean, I've seen this happen in many games. Sometimes they never fully fall off. They sort of go down to the level below. And then whatever degree of faith you have in how great they used to be, you can keep deluding yourself they're going to make that one step back up to the top again. Sadly, I've got to tell you, it doesn't happen very often, but it can be fun to hope and to dream like that. So, okay, let's discuss this topic then, because obviously the first team that anyone has to pick out as potential for a great Overwatch team is the Envious squad, because they were the team that had the amazing online streak, which funnily enough is when I first heard about them, because I wasn't really watching during the beta, but I heard all these plebs telling me, oh, it's just like CSGO at the beginning with Nip doing that 87-0. Envious has done, what was it, 56? Was it something around that number?
Something around the line, yeah.
Yeah, and then what I did was, I thought, okay, don't judge it. It's a new game. Maybe it's a similar thing. I looked, found out it was all online cups, and some of them, weren't even all the best teams. So I was like, right, I'm immediately out on that, because Nips 87-0 was actually on LAN, and most of the time, well, some of it in LAN finals. So you can't really fuck with that. You've got to at least be in the same ballpark. Okay, as I say, Envious, the first squad, obviously then going on with slight alterations. They were the team that actually had to overcome their initial LAN problems, where they weren't as fabulous as online, but eventually they did. They won Apex most notably, and were still a very good team after that internationally, and then obviously dominated contenders coming into the Overwatch League. So this is a squad where I think actually, as bizarre as it sounds, because everything we now know, problems with coaching, the fact that actually they don't necessarily have as deep a squad as they thought they did in terms of versatility. What's funny is almost every one of these factors at the time seemed to go in their favour. Like, they seemed like a squad that didn't need coaches. They seemed like a team that actually had the embarrassment of riches, that they could have someone just say, oh, I'll swap over and just play some other hero that isn't even traditional to my role, but still be pretty good at it. Thinking of people like Harry Hook, obviously, these seemed like ridiculous luxuries to have. And then you add in that, okay, yes, Envious certainly didn't win every tournament. They won very few tournaments, in fact, but they were so good, even in the times they would tend to lose, that you could also keep that hope in your mind of like, oh, they'll come back next tournament. Like, they'll always find a way back. So what I'm kind of setting up here, Yiska, is it's kind of ridiculous that this team became as bad as the Dallas Fuel was for a while in the Overwatch League, because they did seem sort of like the chosen team in some senses.
Yeah, and if we remember back the now sadly comical interview with Kai, where he basically said, once we get to America and play on our soil, it's all going to be different. No, he obviously couldn't know
right,
that.
He was, yes.
Yes. I mean,
famous last words.
It's quite interesting that apparently the home field advantage is not as big as the changes either in meta, as we talked about before in terms of patches, but also in terms of league format. So Apex was obviously a much different, even though it technically was, you're still playing your groups and whatever, you still have regular matches, and it doesn't all happen on one weekend like in other esports, but at the same time, the games were still way more spaced out. You had way fewer matches. It's what was probably way harder to counter-strat you, because you didn't actually have that much information on the teams, unless you're obviously a Western team scrimming in Korea, but that's another topic. Yeah, and for some reason, I guess there is something that needs to be said about, okay, the patches, we already elaborated on that, but the selection method of players in different scene states, or rather tournament formats. So what I think was probably what broke Envious the most, despite obviously their meta only coming very, very late now. It was basically that they were now forced into a much more pressured, but also high frequency situation where you can't actually solve things by simply being the better individual player, having the better, I would say, synergy between those members, because suddenly people already caught up with you. The Korean teams definitely were already on your level or ahead of you in that department in terms of the synergy, because the one thing that we always said about Envious was that they had crazy understanding how they were playing together. And that's actually something that coaches or players within that team have echoed to me and had said, well, we actually, like when we came into the league, it just worked. Contenders just worked. It's not like we top down structured our comms or whatever. It like someone just picked up something. It wasn't a conscious decision, and it was so unconscious that we actually couldn't tell you who does what. And switching out as much as they tried to do didn't offer up the immediate results that they wanted. And then on top of that, they also had, I guess it was a little bit more fortunate for London because they seemed to find their new roster quicker than Envious did. I would argue before Stage 3, they actually never found a working starting roster, and someone was always rotating. And even really, who was a set player other than Effect in the old Dallas Fuel of Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3? So that was definitely a problematic part of the structure of the tournament, and it's very hard to reinvent yourself if you have to play 2 high-pressure matches per week.
Sure. So obviously, I think for the Envious one, I mean, some of this basically we talked about in the Effect episode where we were breaking down like the problems Dallas Fuel had. Like some of them, I definitely think are like they had a very flawed approach to how they used the personnel they had. But even then, that has the caveat of like, well, you can't exactly know XQC is going to get banned for this week and then another week. And, you know, it's not like at his role, you had the subs. You know, the subs are for other roles traditionally in Overwatch. People don't tend to have a really good backup tank. So, unfortunately, in that scenario, I don't blame them for things like that. Then you can add in certain meta switches. Again, you can't always necessarily be blamed for, because at the moment, the only team in the league that hasn't suffered from that's the NYXL, basically. It's the only team that has not had some hard, like, swim against the stream type, at least few weeks, which everyone else has had to lesser degrees. And sure, not every team fell apart, but everyone suffered and everyone's benefited. Then I think also with their team, you've got to add in the factor of they did seem like a squad where they probably did rest on their laurels too much with how fabulous some of the players were, which obviously is what cost them at the beginning of Overwatch League, because they tried to use that as the get-out move every time. They tried to get out of jail free by having this guy switch to someone else's hero or someone else practice something completely different. So the big problem I have with this team is it feels like almost everything really did go wrong. Usually when people use that cliche, they're actually really over-exaggerating. This feels like everything that could go wrong did, because everything that they did themselves tended to have a bad result. But then also, even if they'd have made every correct decision, I feel like certain things break against them no matter what, right? Like the very fact that everyone's playing dive for so long early on, there's so much success from that. Wouldn't certain things have cast them down regardless?
You could argue that all their success, other than Contenders, was always sort of on shaky ground or against not that good competition. So if we remember back, even the Apex Season 1 victory was basically fueled by the pickup of Mickey and them having a massive meta switch where suddenly D.Va was competitive. And then, I mean, yes, they then come back into the weaker region, dominate there for a while. I forget the timeline, but really the only ones that could rival them was Rogue, and I think Rogue were actually the ones that eventually broke their winning records at 46 or something in Zero. So I think their success was already sort of problematic in a sense, and already in preseason you could see that they were sort of struggling a little bit. And I'm sure the players must have known at the time, because some of those matches in preseason were on the slightest of margins, and really they won those two based on individual performances a lot of the time. And then you have forget how long it was. I think it's about 2 months where you can prepare for, or 1.5, I think, for Overwatch League. And it didn't seem to help them a lot. Now, the defense that people say that they couldn't play dive actually doesn't sit that well with me, because the problem with that is if I look at the statistics of NYXL, and I specifically look at the most prominent comp of dive comp, which is the Mercy dive variation. So it's Mercy, it's Zenyatta, it's Genji, Tracer, Diva, Winston. NYXL has a terrible record for their normal win rates. Their most successful comps are always around Widow. And Widow, famously, is one of Taimu's better picks. Now,
Sure.
Him struggling was probably also a huge factor in how their season panned out, because they never really seemed to have a specialist on that pick. And if I'm looking at those statistics from other teams, I mean, Widow has been, as much as Zenyatta, a huge part of Overwatch League. You could argue that now in Stage 4, it was probably the most impactful role. Already in Stage 1, we had some breakout performances where people could pretty much hard carry games. For instance, Birdring comes to mind in the stage playoff finals, or Carpe. We saw very little of that. Basically, Dallas also got, I believe, into a lot of Game 5 scenarios where they couldn't clutch it out in the end, because usually explosive players like a Taimu just couldn't bring it or weren't even able to play. So that definitely didn't help. And while dive being a big part of the Overwatch League, at least in our minds and how it sets up and how you play certain maps, that's definitely true, but that doesn't break your season all alone.
Okay. So what would you actually put the main factors as, if you had to, like, if someone said, like, in the equivalent of, you know, some kid asking their dad, like, why did the Romans die out? Like, you'd have to give them sort of 2 or 3 sentences, you know, you can't give them a 20-minute lecture. So what would you put the highest priority on for factors that caused the downfall of Envious? At least from, like, God status anyway, you know.
Well, one way to say it would be they lost in the wrong situations, as to mean that this basically broke them. It sounds whack, but really broke them mentally. I mean, if we're taking Effects Twitter or whatever, and then also Taimu, how he expressed his problems with mental health concerns. I mean, there are also other events during the off season where, I mean, it's shitty to say, but their big brother, obviously in Internet Hulk, passed away. I'm sure that didn't go over well with them. So there are some circumstances in that team that I almost feel like if some things went differently, if Taimu can actually bring his A game for a substantial amount of time, and I actually want a player like Taimu in my team, in the sense that, yeah, sure, he's going to give you bad games, but bad Widow games actually don't lose you as many games as they can win you if someone is super explosive. If Pine takes over a game, it's just over. If Flatter does that to you, for instance, like we saw in Dallas Fuel against the Seoul Dynasty, that where Flatter just completely takes over Blizzard World, that's the situation the Widow pick can influence games. And even if you don't hit your shots as much, there's still ways to work around that. So I think if they had a better mental state all over the season, I think they could have maybe fought for playoffs, be in a situation like Houston, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I kind of see what you mean there, because part of the problem here is that because they went from, at the very minimum, good to very good to really bad, like seemingly overnight in Overwatch League, and they never returned until the very end, and then the circumstances they returned in terms of the meta, right, I've no doubt they were a better team and they'd fixed some things, but we can't yet know if that's exaggerated because they came into a meta that actually finally suited them for once. Maybe they would have just been decent, but just a little bit better if that hadn't happened. And maybe instead, they'd be like the last team scraping for a playoff spot, similar to now, but not with as good a chance, you'd say, overall. But the one problem I have is, the one I can't blame them for is the XQC one, because it's really difficult to ever deal with players like that. Clearly you're someone with talent as well, so you don't just want to kick them out immediately. And I have to say, just as a side tangent, those sorts of players, the fact that they have talent, lures so many organizations down that path of trying to be the one that saves this guy and brings him out of all his problems. And then what they see correctly is the upside's going to be amazing. But the problem is, in doing so, if you end up basically treating the person the way you wouldn't treat a different player in your team, you can basically sacrifice the whole franchise in the sake of trying to save this one guy. So to me, it's the scenario of the drowning guy that'll pull you down as well. So you've got to just let the guy go at that point in time. But the knock-on effect rather of XQC's problems is that really is it's not that that's the most important position, but it's the key position in terms of, as I said, most teams have one player that plays that role. They don't have a sufficient backup. And so even if your player doesn't play well, you at least need it to be the real tank that's playing in the game, because it's going to set all the rest of your lineups. It's going to set how you play on the different maps.
Yes.
And so I have to say, to me, the fact that wasn't really in their hands, that was taken out of their hands by suspensions and stuff that they could never predict when that stuff's going to happen. Even if you thought it was inevitable, what he might get done once, you can't know when. And so the worst part about that to me is when you then lose, you can't then even really know if the player swaps you've made were correct, because you don't really have your team in the game. So you try to player swap, it doesn't work, and then you even start second guessing that, was that even, should I switch again and swap? Because if you look at what they did with Seagull towards the last stage, I think they could have come to an answer like that way quicker if they'd have sort of had some control factors, whereas they never did until they got a proper tank in there, basically, because that's the one spot that they were always in and out with and they never fully had. So I think when you add then losing like that, here's the thing, I don't even know what the solution is when you still have XQC but you're not able to play in your lineup. At that point in time, you might try anything and it might not work. So actually that would to some degree psychologically wreck you as a team, knowing that there's not even really maybe a right answer out there when we're just grasping around for anything. So when you are a team that, with all the factors we said before, just naturally seem to be fantastic, could always find solutions, could play yourself through a game where you probably are playing a better opponent, have the clutch factor. If you have sort of the wrong moments for your losing streak and then the wrong things happen, that means sort of as you're trying to climb out of the hole, you get kicked back in again. I could see that breaking someone, even someone who's considered a winner or something,
Yeah. If you think about the players that are on and Envious, these guys, with the exception, I believe, of OG and Seagull, were all massive champions, or at least very close to getting it big. So if we start from Rascal, obviously Apex Season 3 Finals participant, could have definitely won that as well. Yeah, was very close. The Envious squad, AKM was on Rogue, obviously very successful team in the Western context. These guys weren't used to losing as much as they did. Even in the worst of times in Apex, they were still winning probably upwards of 65% of their matches. So suddenly to come in and only win 30% or 20% of your matches a stage is obviously, that just is a completely different situation. And while some of the players have shown bounce back ability in their characters, such as Taimu, for instance, because he once actually was out of IDDQD for a while and then worked himself back to the team. But yeah, if you start out winning and pretty much dominating your region, then even winning in Apex, doing pretty well in the other ones, also arguably in being set up by good fortune to look like you're actually doing better than they probably were at the time, because they at least in Apex Season 3 had a pretty easy bracket, I found.
Sure.
Yeah, it's problematic then to suddenly face those end bosses. And let's not forget, I don't think anyone from those established teams actually expected teams like the Boston Uprising, or even really the Valiant, to do as well as they're doing. And it's definitely not the Los Angeles Gladiators. So,
Sure.
there are three teams that you probably didn't expect to develop as hard as they ended up doing.
Actually, even though we'll move on to the next team, I feel like that there's like a topic within there for Dallas Fuel that we haven't talked about that we'll do on like a different video. Because what we should do as another topic is something along the lines of how meta switches messed up people's tank lines, basically. Because I think if you look in the Overwatch League, that's another thing that fucked so many people. Like how Winston was played being changed, just completely wrecked certain teams. I mean, obviously in the Dallas Fuel one, you look at how Mickey was no longer even a viable D.Va player, never mind one of the better ones, you know. If you look at the teams where they went up and down, I think there's a pretty decent thread there. So anyway, well, I'll tease that for now. We'll go to the next one. So the next one, obviously, if we're going through the early great teams who fell off, and admittedly, this team fell off more than they were on top, right away. They basically were on top immediately and then fell off. It's Misfits, obviously.
Yes.
The now Swedish team, but obviously in the past Swedish/French squad, which then later on became, admittedly in many different variants, the team we now know as the Florida Mayhem. Now, obviously, this is one where they never recovered in the Overwatch League, so there's no redemption arc here. Basically, once they get the Overwatch League, it's shit, and we can get into that, and that's definitely something that's been discussed a lot. But what I like about this one is you can really set up a lot of the downfall way before the Overwatch League. And if anything, I think most of the problems they had in the Overwatch League, beyond organizational things like you only have 6 players, you don't have a proper coaching staff, stuff like that is not the players' fault. But everything else that the players could do and choices they made, seemingly, were just exacerbated, exaggerated versions once it got to the Overwatch League. And that's why they were way worse, because they already fell off fairly heavily after that early success, right?
Yes. I mean, they already, in our minds, because they were so dominant in contenders, I don't think they dropped a match. It feels like they won Contenders EU. No, they didn't. They actually lost to Giganti in the finals, right? So that already is a red flag. Then I don't think they did that well in preseason. I'm not sure if I recall that correctly. But already having such a small squad, there is not really much you can improve on other than individually. I mean, they took Swoosh off of Swoosh was the DPS player of Movistar Riders, comes in and replaces Reinforce as the main tank, and had at this point not really displayed any other tanks, and then picked up Winston pretty quickly, though I think there is some overlap in skill sets between those two heroes, or at least, I mean, there's some idea how the space, like if I'm a Genji player, I understand where my tank has created space for me or whatever, right? So that's conceptually is in there. That doesn't mean I understand that in a Reinhardt meta. So that was already pretty interesting, even though I have to say, you would think that because what Misfits basically was best about was actually playing dive. It's quite interesting that they weren't able to beat anyone else but Dallas Fuel and Shanghai for most of this season, because you would think that they would be able to eke out some wins somewhere with a meta that wasn't really that stacked against them. It was overall pretty much what they were playing in EU contenders. And then I'm not sure if actually people dropped off or if it was just, I think my read on this was they tried to play as they did in EU contenders for stage 1, and they realized pretty quickly that they were found out fairly easily. And then they tried to switch it up, and then obviously Logix dropped off because suddenly he was required to both support the backline and be next to Zope when the opponent traces, or to duel the tracer. Then he also has to go and help on the front line. And that was never really Logic's playstyle. Logix was at his best when he could beast opponents, and he did hard carry for a long time in Europe. When they took that playstyle away from him, I think they completely dropped off, and then only recovered when they gave him back that situation. Now, obviously, then Saya player comes in, and while that was a great pickup, I'm not sure if the pickups they made, and that's actually a reoccurring theme across all these dropped off gods, is that they actually, I don't know if it's hubris because they still have the trophies they won in mind or whatever, but they didn't really pick up other than Dallas Fuel, who really tried and obviously failed in some of those pickups, but also got some pretty good ones in OG and Anko, those teams didn't seem to really fix their issues as they presented themselves, at least to people outside the teams. So Logix wasn't the worst play on Misfits by a long shot. I could argue he was probably the best performing player on that team. Bring in Sireplay. Yes, Sireplay is a better player than Logix, even though they have a higher win percentage of maps with Logix. But then even Awesome Guy, it wasn't actually that much of an upgrade. What about the backline? Why did they not switch up the backline? That was arguably the second worst in Overwatch League. That's the big question that I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole bunch of issues with this team. Like, first of all, on that one, okay, the back line. Well, one of the main issues, if you think about it, in their team was that, like, bear in mind, they're not a team that made many big blockbuster moves aside from that famous freeway trade. That was about it. And then beyond that, they tried to clearly pick up talent that, wasn't blowing the doors of everything, but they just thought, right, this will work with us. In fact, they're a team where a lot of how they worked reminds me of a lot of the stories I've heard from the Swedish Counter-Strike team, that, like, some of the teams there, they either went one way or the other, right? You either went the route that back in the day it used to be the SK Gaming team went, which is you just recruit talent. You just get the best player you can at any point in time. You don't even think based on what style he plays or whatever. You just think, right, if I have the best players on my team, probably going to be able to figure it out and win. Or you go the other way, which is the extreme opposite, which is I'm only getting people that I like, that I think are cool to be around, have a good personality, similar temperament. And what's mad about both styles is, when one's up and one's down, it seems like, right, well, that's just obvious, For example, like, if the team with all the skilled players is winning, you're like, well, obviously you should just recruit the best players, right? But then those teams don't always last as long. Then you have the teams that have all the people who are social magnets, as it were, like, they fit together very well. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It makes sense. Now, what's great is if that team gets very good, it might be like one of the most consistent teams ever, because you can work through all your problems. You've got fantastic team play. But the downside is when those teams start to go to shit, which is what I'm alluded to here, they take forever to change, because since one of the main factors that decided whether you recruited or kicked people was social element, as long as the social element of the team doesn't completely break down, you'll just hold on to those players for too long. So if anyone who knows CSGO, you basically listen to the story of ninjas in pajamas right there. They went from the best team Counter-Strike's ever seen to now, like, a team that hasn't even been at a major in about 2 years or something. So, in this scenario, what anyone can look back now, any kid can look back and go, well, they held on to that player for a long time, didn't they? Like, a year, 2 years extra. That's kind of what the Misfits guy seems to have done, because think about the move they didn't make, which was, does VeXii have to leave the starting lineup, or does he have to, again, switch role and let someone else take his role? They never made that judgment. And if you remember, this is a question I asked Reinforce on Oversight. This is one of those rare times where I'm going to toot my own horn and say I thought it was a great question that some people underestimated the value of his answer on, where I told him that because there's all these positive elements to Korean culture that makes Koreans the best, that I was always looking from a similar lens in Counter-Strike, and what I'd found was that because of this component of thinking, that it seemed like the positive of Swedish culture was they had really strong team bonds, and they had sort of teams that fit together because there weren't too many egos or whatever, they kind of naturally filters up. So what I asked him was, in the same way as the negatives of the Korean system would be things like you burn your players out, you're incredibly cutthroat, you don't necessarily take established talent, you take new talent and you craft them, there's things that you could definitely call negatives. I asked him basically, what did he think the negative was of the Swedish culture then, since obviously the best Swedish Overwatch team actually has been fairly underwhelming. They haven't had the success he'd hoped for. And if you remember, his answer was something along the lines of, because people weren't super egotistical or very individualistic, it meant that they basically didn't have the hard conversations when a person couldn't do their job anymore, or it wasn't going quite as well as it should. Instead, it was more you just don't have those confrontations, which basically your team is pre-selected not to have personalities that do that. But the downside is you're going to end up in a scenario where it takes until the end of Overwatch League Season 1 before any player dares to say, Zebasai, no offense, mate. You were a great TF2 player. We've enjoyed playing with you in this team. But, if we want to be the best team, we're going to have to move on, or you're going to have to move on, whichever you want, or you can be the coach. Because the one move they did make was obviously they let Nevix go. And if anything, that was the worst move. He actually turned out to be a pretty good player when he got to Shock.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair,
and Cloud9, sure.
Yeah, I mean that can obviously also be coaching, but basically what you're describing is that Misfits was basically trying to be Nip without ever showing any magic. They're basically fucking Neville Longbottom among Muggles, and then in the Contenders Finals, they get thrown off their fucking broom and never really changed. Or I don't understand how you even can. Yes, if I'm a NIP that obviously has that history, and once in a while actually can cram it out and win an event, sure. Yes, I can delude myself into thinking that.
Sadly, though, that is also the format difference, mate. Like, that's the saddest thing. I realise by saying this, it's going to sound so cruel to people who now have to watch the Overwatch League and that's it. But if you had an open circuit, that's actually one of the best things if you're a fan, is it feeds your delusion, because every now and then your team actually will have a good run. Just because they're doing like 8 variants of it, they're not doing one thing that all adds together. Like, if you had to add every tournament together, obviously Nip would never have won anything in CSGO over the last 3 years, but as long as you have a tournament 3 or 4 days, they could do it. Listen, if they have the right magical... Because remember, you don't even need the run to be all 4 days. Maybe getting out of the groups is the first 2. All you really need maybe is even 1 day and you have an awesome run to a final. That would have happened in Overwatch. I'm telling people, if you've seen the way the circuit works, you would just have a week where someone would be untouchable like that. But if you ask them to do it for... I mean, how many was it? Like 20 weeks on it. So 20 weeks is too much to ask for anyone. Like, even great teams are going to have a hard time having consistency.
Sure, but then again, if that was true and they were able to peak like that, surely they would have taken a game of at least a mid-tier team. They weren't, right? They never had those peaks, and basically I think they only ever won against Dallas and Shanghai Dragons. And Shanghai Dragons were actually pretty close. So no, I don't see the merit in keeping that team together in that sense, other than possibly intangible stuff about the social aspects. And if I remember correctly what Reinforce said on that Oversight episode, it's basically that Sebosai is a natural-born leader, and it's very hard to kick someone like that.
Yes. Because
that's also one thing that Overwatch League teams notoriously lack, these nucleus type of players. The problem is if that guy is not good enough to perform on the role, or or isn't capable of doing that job, or isn't on top of his game or whatever, that's pretty bad for your performance. So yeah, I don't know. Misfits from the beginning, I don't think they really expected to get into playoffs with that roster, or could have reasonably expected to.
And also, I think another factor that I wanted to explore for this is that this is how bad the Florida Mayhem is now, right? When you look at their squad they currently have, aside from Sire player, there's no one who's even a contender for vaguely the best in their role.
No
one. And yet, this is the crazy thing. The only name you even look at still is you think, could Tavik ever get good again? Well, that's the problem, right? Is like, even back when they were a pretty good team, this team didn't really have a lot of superstar names. Like, you looked at the squad, they might have people who were like good at their role, but even then, some of those were getting devalued over the years before we even get to the Overwatch League. And so that's obviously, to me, that was actually the immediate alarm bell that went off in my head when they did this 3-way trade, when they did the Luminosity Rogue Misfits trade. It's like, holy fuck, you've just sent a bunch of the star players the other way from your squad. What are you doing? Like, this is so dangerous. But the big problem for me is you have to look at Tavik and ask, how did he perform? And actually, I have to say, I already thought he was sliding off before Overwatch League started. Like, him being a fabulous player already seemed to have its own issues before Overwatch League. And then in the Overwatch League, I feel so bad for any fans who only watched in Overwatch League because they don't know who Tavik is. Like, they've never seen Tavik. They've just seen a guy where people are telling you this guy used to be good, and you're watching in the game, and it's like, yes, his team is terrible. I totally understand that. But even within that context, it's not a very convincing performance, even for someone on a bad team.
Yeah. I wonder if Tavik's future is something similar to Siegel's, where I think the guy has also pretty good mind for the game. He's probably where Siegel is probably a better mind. He probably also has the better mechanics. I wonder if either Zenyatta or D.Va could be a role for him, because I'm not sure. Like, his mechanics probably aren't up to par in comparison to other flex players like a libero in the league. But yeah, I mean, it could also just him working around the team, because with all the ego the guy is, one thing you can't say about him is that he doesn't give up his positions or his play style in order to accommodate a team. Like that's definitely something he does. I'm not sure if he puts himself into these positions or if coaches do or whatever, but he usually will pick off picks or whatever, or will play things that aren't as favorable to him in terms of looking clutch. So I'm not sure. Hopefully there's still something that where his performance can, once again be rejuvenated over the next season. But yeah, he wasn't looking like the old Tivik, who we once, if we're being honest, there was definitely a time where we thought of Tivik as a top 5 player in the world.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But that's also, in fact, that, if anything, that plays into what I'm saying, because part of what made him fabulous was he was an amazing star player anyway. Then he had all this mad versatility. Then actually within his team, right, in terms of actually being someone with confidence, he seemed like someone who had a killer instinct, which actually can be a downside of Swedish people, I've found at times, because they trust in the group element so much that you don't necessarily have the one person who wants to step forward and kind of lead by example. So yeah, these are all positives, but unfortunately they either become a crutch eventually, or if they ever fade, you're in a lot of trouble. Right, so one other thing I want to ask about with the Misfits team is, once they actually got to the Overwatch League, do you put any blame on them still? Because I have to say personally, I think they were easily the most hamstrung team by organisation from beginning to end of the Overwatch League. I mean, basically, all this team did for them is get them a coach partway through, and then give them Sire player at the very end to literally just be like a high-skill bot that just sits there and hits widow shots, and you still lose the game anyway. Like, obviously you have no time to build up synergy with this guy. He speaks a different language. Like, if I look at it, you'd have had to be a very good team to go through what they did in terms of like limited resources and still get anything out of Overwatch League, I think.
Yes. Though, to be fair, they already had those issues before Overwatch League.
Sure.
Which they wouldn't tell you because they were winning, but those things were already going on at the time. And I wonder, like, there probably wasn't a world where they don't sign with Misfits. I wonder how it would have went if they had actually a different organization. For instance, if like such an event like with Rogue, where they thought they would get Overwatch League but didn't, how that would pan out if they actually got into a different organization. Because Mineral, I mean, he was a player, right? So initially, I heard some things that this wasn't also intended initially, that they thought they would bring him on as a coach but couldn't. And then now I'm not sure who else was behind that. I think there was one manager, and yeah, I'm actually not sure. I think they were 3 people tops in terms of staff when the league started, and then they stocked up. The problem was for me that they had this interview where they tried to explain, and it sounded like, oh, we didn't know. We didn't know that all the other teams had 5 coaches and 2 managers and a cook and whatever, while we have our players drive themselves to the venue and whatever. So I'm not sure. I don't think they were set up for victory at all. And yeah, I'm not sure if actually that much has changed since then, other than bringing in more personnel. Because keep in mind, Mineral also tapped out somewhere in the middle of the season because he was completely burned out from the experience.
Understandably so.
Yes.
Right, so the next team we're going to do then, it's going to obviously be a Korean one, because let's be real, like the gods of Overwatch League most of the time were Korean once we got heavily going into Apex after that anomaly first season. So obviously the first great team was already there. It was Lunatic-Hai. Now, I have to say, we discussed this a little bit on that episode when we were talking about coaching with Sideshow, which is that I actually noted that unlike a lot of people back then, this is what I wanted to ask. Is it the fact that when you look back now at how good Lunatic-Hai were and all the problems that their squad had as the Seoul Dynasty, I noticed that you and Sideshow were almost talking about Esker in like nostalgic terms.
Oh.
Like you'd come to gain a new appreciation, because obviously at the time the harsh Reddit analysis of Lunatic-Hai was like, wow, the most godlike sort of like back end of a team you could have. Fuck these DPS, they're all pure trash. And then half the time it was people just like memeing on them like, wow. I mean, here's the thing, they're not entirely wrong. There were some fabulous DPS players that we now know that were going out in like group stage 1 of Apex, like there were talent out there, sure, but it kind of does look now like Eska did more than people gave him credit for, right?
Yeah, probably in hindsight, in terms, I probably undervalued the player type that he was, because he was at times possibly the worst tracer in Overwatch League while winning Apex Season 3. It's insane. If that Sombra switch doesn't come in, I still believe that it would be sort of like a Zebo-size situation where you're just too bad as an individual player to carry for your team. But other than that, he seemed to be the glue for a lot of what's happening. And I mean, that team is looking for a leader right now, because they tried to get in Gambler, who was the shot caller of the old LW Blue, and you could argue, I mean, it's probably not fair to put that on him, but since he's joined the team and played, they actually had worse performances. They started the season 14-6, but missed the playoffs twice, though narrowly, right? That isn't too bad. 14-6 is still easily playoff. I think they were second place at that time, right? So the league didn't actually start out that terrible. The terrible part was that they then seemed to drop off when they couldn't solve their issues. And yes, the problem is, if we think about Lunatic-Hai, we had Eska as the leadership personality, but we also had probably the best backline of pre-Overwatch League. In Ru Jae-hong and Toby, who were probably both the best players on their position, which were Ana and Lucio. Now, suddenly that's not played at all anymore in Overwatch League. Briefly in Stage 2, teams tried out Lucio Dive, which was quickly abandoned once again. So having that backbone suddenly really average, I wouldn't put them any much more below that. Also, Jae-hong has some positional issues, but he's probably still a serviceable Zen, even though I'm not sure if I'm a Seoul Dynasty, that's the problem, basically. Okay, we don't know what the next season will look like, but if Seoul stays the only Korean team, I would think that a lot of players, especially looking towards Season 3, where you come home, a lot of the top Korean players want to play on your team. Now, I'm not sure if you can't easily get a better Zenyatta than Ru Jae-hong at this point, who obviously is also already pretty old for a professional Overwatch League player. So someone like a Bazzi, for instance, if he goes back to flex support, for instance, comes to mind. I mean, even getting players like an AimGod or like a Neko or whatever from other teams, your name being the only Korean franchise should have that pull. So that backline being really devalued because of patches was a problem for them, and definitely the main tank position. Now, people had this idea that Lunatic-Hai, if we think of Lunatic-Hai, everyone thinks they were the best team pre-Overwatch League because they won 2 Apex seasons, and we think of them as this unbeatable monster, which they definitely weren't. They in both seasons they won, I think they were pretty close to being eliminated in the playoff stages, and the Apex system worked a little bit differently, where you had a second group stage, and losing a match there isn't actually that problematic. You just get dropped down, but they always just squeezed it out. And then famously in the finals, those were also pretty close. Like,
they're all 4-3s, yeah.
Basically, the only difference, or there's many parallel universes where 5 minutes of Apex history go differently, and we easily think of Runaway as the best Korean Overwatch League team, because they could have won that final against Lunatic-Hai, which was a best of 7, and they narrowly lost 3-4, and then once again against GC.Busan, again 3-4. If those 5 minutes go differently, Lunatic-Hai has 1 win victory, Runaway has 2. Okay, that's obviously hindsight stuff, but they were definitely not these demigods that some people think they were, because also they didn't actually win Apex Season 4. And the reason people gave so much, I mean, if we look at the preseason rankings, a lot of them had Dynasty as first spot. The reason for that was because Fleta was coming in, and Munchkin as well, who were considered very good DPS players. And we all thought, well, the one thing that the Lunatic-Hai roster was missing was obviously DPS players. So maybe that puts them ahead of GC.Busan once again, which it probably could have had that continued in that meta. But yeah, in now with their backline and frontline, at least in the terms of the main mechanic position, because I still think Zumba is a very serviceable player and probably one of the better performers on his role in the Overwatch League. Yeah, I don't think that it was realistic to expect them to win it. I don't think I actually had them as the strongest team, if I think back.
The thing is, I'm kind of on the similar page, which is like the thing that kills me about this squad is when I look back now at the Lunatic-Hai team, I actually feel like I was unfair by thinking that like they had godlike players and then the rest were sort of like just riding their coattails. Right, yes, they had a very flawed squad even then when they were winning. But it's like everyone had a role or responsibility that they could actually do. Like, if anything, the genius of that team, this is one of the places I first noticed that guy, like TS Robin 311 or whatever his name is, the guy who does all the translations on Reddit, was, if you remember, that guy who was a coach for the team, I can't remember his name, for Lunatic-Hai, used to always do like streams where he would explain like his perspective on what was going on with the team or how Overwatch should be played. And first of all, they were fucking amazing, these translations. Like, he always had so many interesting details or like observations about other teams sometimes. But then one of the things I always noticed about his own team whenever he talked about them was that he would always it's like it would always be about how someone else had to like swap a role or play a little bit differently to make the team work, you know? So I remember him saying something about how like Toby had to play a particular different way, and like I think it was like season 2 or something, you know? And then obviously at one point in time they had to make this like Miro switched things up and became a bit different. Who Are You came into the squad, who they obviously didn't take through the Overwatch League, which now we look back and go, imagine what you could do if he was old enough and you were able to bring him into the league immediately. That's one thing people misunderstand. Then yes, Esker as a pure DPS player is terrible, clearly. But somehow he did sort of play within that squad as a DPS in a way that made some sort of sense. Like, it wasn't like he was an idiot and he was just getting his head back in. He just wasn't very skilled, but he played his role in the team, and you can see why they were able to win. So you look back now, the entire squad has like charm and has some positives to them, you know. But I also think part of the worry here is you had these two players in Ryu Jae-hong and Miro who at different times were the best player. Like, they were fabulous at their role. Yes. And especially Ryu Jae-hong, you just don't want to believe that guy could not be as good. In an Overwatch League, he's another player. I feel so bad for people who just came along and they were like, right, show me all these people you've been talking about. So I want to see Taimu, and then Tavik, and then Rejo. It's like, yeah, sorry, mate, you missed that. It's like someone being born in like the fucking 70s. Like, oh, where's all the 60s at? Where's Hippie-dom? It's like that. Yeah, that all died in like, I think it was like 1969 at some Rolling Stones concert where the Hells Angels beat everyone up or something. Like, you know, that you missed it. You're too late for that one. So if your best player, an integral player of your team, and a shot caller, best player in the world, all these sorts of things people said about Ryu Jae-hong, if he really does just drop off a cliff and never fully come back, I mean, I don't really know what you can do there. You can't kick him out of the team. You have to give him time to try and come back. You've got to believe it's possible. It's like you built your team around him, basically.
I mean, there's still possibility that Anna comes back into the meta through some meta switches, and suddenly you have possibly. I don't think his skill decayed in that regard. I think it's actually probably picked related, because even back then, yes, we thought of chips.
That's the sick thing, though, right? Because here's the thing. Okay, sure, a lot of the Zens now have amazing aim. But when he was Anna, he was fucking unbelievable.
Yeah,
like,
unreal.
He was so OP on that hero, it was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So you'd think some of that raw aim would carry over to Zenyatta.
I mean, the thing is with especially new games where you sometimes think, okay, so the early players, they had skills that if you look at them, like, if you look at League of Legends, how it was played in Season 1 and now, and how the mechanics are of certain players, it looks super whack, right? You can't believe that was actually the best player. Sure. And I think if you look now at Ryu Jae-hong highlights, he's still absolutely insane on Ana. Yes. Like, these things still look super relevant, borderline godlike for today's skill level. I think like we know that, for instance, Jonak is also pretty good. Ana, I wouldn't see how Jaehong's skill could have deteriorated to the point where he's not in contention for one of the better Ana performances. The problem is that in Overwatch League, yes, there are some Ana situations where you can play, especially on defense. Problem is you also need a Zenyatta, and you don't want to switch your Zen around. So now you have to put Toby on that pick. How good is his aim and whatever? This meta actually stole some excellence from us, and now with Tracer also being faded out, you could even argue that this is happening once again to some of those players, where there are players that have honed that particular hero for such a long time, and now it's out of the meta, and we basically have to grind back and see who's the best on these new established picks.
Sure. Because I guess that's the weirdest part about the team that they had in Seoul Dynasty is if I try to use like hindsight now, if Ryu Jae-hong's going to come into the league and have that many problems from day one pretty much and never really sort of assert himself as the player he was before, and so many other pieces of the squad were used to like fitting around each other and like sort of giving up room, as it were, even adding in a super DPS isn't going to fix those problems. Like these are things that are like top down already going to cause you massive issues. So not really that much of a surprise. Like I have to say, I noticed that theirs was the squad. This is like a little trick everyone can try when you're trying to analyze games. Is beyond just what you actually know about the player's current level, just try and look for what, like make a fictional rating in your mind of like name value. And what you'll find is the name value, there's a lag after the player gets worse before it drops off. And likewise, there's actually a lag when you're on the way up. If you're a beginning player, you'll never get like full credit because everyone initially is like, well, you can't be that good. You're nobody, you're on a shit team. Oh, okay, first time online, whatever, you got lucky, let's see, it's like there's a lag the opposite way. But watch the way that works, and you'll see eventually the teams that ruined everything about their squad. Because it was similar with the Dallas Fuel when they were at their absolute worst in Stage 3. You looked at the lineup, and part of you even was just like, just wipe the slate clean. None of these players can ever make it. Like they're all terrible. But that's obviously ridiculous. The difference is, when I look now at the Seoul Dynasty squad, it's not really that sick a squad, really. Like the name value is decayed like a motherfucker on this squad. There's basically almost nothing except Fleta left. I mean, I'll give credit to some of the others. Like, okay, people like Wicked weren't complete wastes of time always, but even they, like, you don't see the potential put out way. That was it. This squad was a mixture of like a couple of amazing players, a few like with really big potential, and then players who were like, they were the make weights. And at the end of it, you've got nothing. You've basically got like Fleta. I mean, what else is there on Seoul Dynasty now? Yeah,
basically, we actually have a refute this about this in the works, where I basically say, if I'm Seoul Dynasty, I'm rebuilding about Zumba and Fleta and kick the rest. Maybe I keep Jae-young around for the possibility of having Ana come back into the meta, but other than that, I don't like Wicked. Yes. I mean, he's also, you probably need a Pharah specialist, but Fleta can also play that. The guy can play basically everything at this point. So I don't know. The thing is also what we shouldn't look over is there also seems to be a coaching issue with Seoul Dynasty, because if everyone used to be a pretty good player and probably, like if I'm looking at the talent, what I thought of them before Overwatch League began, especially also when they had Bunny and whatever, in my mind, all of those players were above average. So how is it that only 2 players now look serviceable? That has to be a coaching issue. Like it's too much of a coincidence that so many players so rapidly decay. So I think they're just being misused in some ways. It's also, I'm not sure, like, we have to think that Lunatic-Hai won in a once again in a tournament structure that was very different, and I wonder actually how big coaches were back then. Yes, there were certain curveballs that people were throwing at each other, especially in finals, but like for instance, in Apex Season 4, GC.Busan destroyed Lunatic-Hai twice with basically the same strategy. Basically counter diving and then Gesture and Profit completely pillaging Rujeon. Now then, when it came into the meta where they for a while played Mercy and Lucio, they completely pillaged Toby. For some reason, they can't figure out how to keep those targeted players alive. While when I look at NYXL, they completely play a counter strategy successfully against that. How they set up their tanks, how they protect Jonak or the other support, it works much better. And that is preparation, that is scouting how a team is playing. The pathing of Gesture and Profit is found out. And I wonder how. I mean, I think till stage 3, the GC.Busan roster, or then in correlation. So let's just say Gesture and Profit, we were like something mad, like 14-0 in maps against Lunatic-Hai or Seoul Dynasty. So I don't know, that at some point you got to figure out what's going wrong there, because that looked like the easiest pickings there was.
Sure. Right, we'll go on to the last team now. By the way, on a random side note, when I was looking through one of those old Wikipedia pages for like one of the Apex tournaments, I think it was season 3, the one we're talking about, where it was like the Lunatic-Hai Panthera one in the final. Tell you what, if you want to do a name value check but go back in history, that Kongdu Panthera lineup was straight fire.
Yes.
Look at that fucking team now. If you just look who was in it, that's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
How did that team not win more? Fucking hell, that was what an underwhelming squad. Then again, though, that was also where, like, they did take the Kongdu organization like 3 seasons to figure out, like, stop splitting the players up between the two teams and making 2 5th to 8th level teams, you morons. So, just a side note, but yeah, that team looks fucking unreal. We should do an episode about them sometime, because them and Lunatic, LW Blue, Luxury Box Blue, it never made any sense that these teams didn't win more. Like, you look back now, they have some mad rosters. Okay, so the last name is obviously going to be GC.Busan, because actually, this is what's going to sound weird to people. People are going to think, right, you're stretching it a bit now. Have London Spitfire really fallen off that much? Like, okay, they did fall off for one stage, okay, and they didn't do that great in another one. But first of all, if you want to just look at the GC.Busan contingent, they have fallen off like a motherfucker, because half of them aren't even in the squad anymore or in any way in contention. What they basically have is they have Kongdu Panthera plus Profit plus Gesture, and occasionally some of the others get to play depending on what the lineup is. Like Hagapan gets in there, you know. Like, they don't really use the GC.Busan. So actually, it's pretty fitting to do the death of the GC.Busan team, because obviously they're one of the teams that's, unlike the others, is going to almost have like a bell curve-esque rise and fall if you look at the relevancy of the squad. Because starting out, obviously these weren't top players at the beginning of Overwatch. No one heard of any of these players pretty much, even though you're talking about them now. 2 of them still arguably the best and the best duo in terms of how they sync up in Overwatch League. So this is a squad, right? How would you describe this team getting to the top?
So, famously, they are, I think, the only Royal Rollers we... wait, let me think. Yeah, the only Royal Rollers we have in Overwatch. So, they came in Apex Season 4, pretty unknown, and then... I mean, they famously beat Lunatic-Hai twice, and then eke it out closely in the finals against Runaway, right? So, that team was really convincing, especially in how they played counter dive. I mean, I almost don't understand why it doesn't work anymore. Because if you look at the Apex Season 4 VODs, it's like someone dives into them, and whoever permeates that barrier of death just gets immediately turned to. Like, it's like basically like automated turrets just completely killing a Winston in under a second simply with burst. But as a counter dive scenario, like, they had a very good idea what they would do if a dive was coming in, how to isolate a target, how to keep people alive, then how to create these situations with Gesture and Profit, how to set up, how to deplete cooldowns, how to get an ultimate advantage. Famously, Gesture was beastly with those. I think Wolf coined the term eco jumps. So what he would basically do was he would jump onto the opponent Zenyatta, who at this time had the Transcendence or whatever, and he would either force out the Transcendence of the Zenyatta player or the Lucio's barrier in order to keep him alive without using much more than his Winston jump and then Profit also coming in. So they really, in that sense, messed with ult economies because you weren't previously supposed to get so much value out of your eco pushes. Now, coming into Overwatch League, that team, it's quite interesting because the Royal Road continues, doesn't it? Yes, they don't win stage 1 in the rankings, but they get into the finals, excruciating day, and in the end clap NYXL. Yes. I think they played something mad. Was it like 12 or wait, let me think, it has to have been
probably 12 in a row, right? Oh no, 12 wins out of however many in the series.
Yeah, I mean it was crazy. And then
I guess I'd say 15 maps. I think it was something along those lines, right?
Yes. And they were one of those rosters that counted on having 2 complete rosters. And we initially thought, okay, maybe they keep the Kondu Panthera together, then add Bedosin and Fury, have that as a team, and then they play GC.Busan, they scrim against each other. Maybe they even employ a strategy where they put one team on one map or whatever. That never happened. Yes, they tried to get that GC.Busan magic back somewhere in the midseason when it wasn't looking so good for them. But that also never seemed to happen again. And they basically formed like a hybrid out of the 2 new players, as well as 2 GC.Busan players in Gesture and Profit, and then obviously Birdring and what am I missing? Birdring and yeah, I guess that's the combination. So once they found that roster, I was convinced they were now going to be the team that was to rival NYXL for the rest of the season. They kick, I think it was after stage 1, right? They kick Bishop, their head coach, and somehow, yes, they had a pretty good performance. What was their score? 15-5 after stage 1 and stage 2. That's pretty good, right? That puts them, I think, was it 3rd place in the Overwatch League at that point? Or 2nd place?
2nd even.
Yeah. And then they start to drop off. Now, stage 3, stage 4, already, I think there was a great stat by Captain Planet who said that over the last half of the season, there's only one team that has less than 50% win rate in their matches. They went 9-11 and still made it into playoffs, is London Spitfire. So that's already a pretty crazy situation. And you have to think, my lord, selling Fisher has to sting. Even though, like Susie said, I think what Susie means when she says, yes, we're sort of not regretting selling Fisher is that we like that he's now finding success and whatever, and we want him to be happy and whatever. You can't be happy that this guy now takes places over you consistently ever since he's left your team. Now, while I don't think that he should have started over Gesture, is still pretty problematic that you basically boosted one of your direct opponents as much as he did, though you can't predict that to be the case, I don't think. Like, to put Fisher into a team that I believe was 9th place at the time they traded him off, and now one last stage in terms of the season standings, and then also, I mean, yes, they lost first round in the playoffs, but yeah, I mean, they couldn't have anticipated that. At the same time, what I do fault them for is the system that seemingly was working for them was to have 2 teams where you can scrim against. And if we're thinking about these scenarios in Overwatch League where patches are switching up so quickly, so what do you want to do is practice these new things effectively. So the way you can do that and make your practice time more efficient is drills. And you can definitely drill better with a team that you can play. Yes, pause now and pause again. And you pause like 3 times a play minute and completely like explain stuff to people. Or you can say, well, we run this A attack 50 times in a row and then we reset the map and we try this again or whatever. I think if that is actually what the Valiant is doing, that could be an instrumental part of why they were able to increase their level, even though their B team is not as good. But at the same time, if you can run these drills, I think it's much more time efficient than playing the entire map out over and over again in scrim blocks, because you don't control what the other team wants to practice. So you just play a normal match. So what I do fault them for is not filling up that 12th slot again. And to think, HawpT came pretty late into the shock, right? So you have to wonder, why did London Spitfire not pick up Architect? Because at the time that this could have been possible, Bertring was slumping his tits off. Probably the worst slump this guy has ever had in his career.
This is where he was like taking himself out the game, right?
It was unreal. He was actually, I looked at the performances, and obviously I'm not a huge fan of Hurek. Hurek was outperforming Bertring hard. Bertring at a time could have been one of the worst performing DPS players in the Overwatch League when he was playing like that. And yes, there's obviously the injury that he had, some wrist stuff. I don't know. If you had Architect during that time, and yes, again, you probably, without inside information, can't know that this kid also, on top of a Nuts Genji and a Nuts Pharah, also has a Nuts Widowmaker. I don't know if you can know that, but it would have slotted in so well into the London Spitfire. It's actually unreal.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems I had with this team when it was made, was this bizarre scenario where you heard that they've signed two top-level Korean teams, both to be part of this squad, but there isn't one main team, and they're going to figure it out, because immediately the first worry I have there is like, how long is it going to take to figure out which players get to play from which squad, and how much is coaching and going to be involved? Because, if I'm the coach of the old squad, if I'm the coach of the Panthera squad and you're a player from the GC.Busan, I'm going to give you a chance because you're in my team, but obviously I'm going to be biased to the player who's from my team if I think he's better or fits the squad. So already that was already a potential problem. And then I even thought it through. The best case scenario would still have sucked for Spitfire, which is, let's say you end up picking, as they did basically, mostly one squad with a few good players from another one. Then you end up with a scenario where people will always wonder what would happen if that other squad had been on, like what would happen if GC.Busan had been on their own Overwatch League team and then had whatever issue that I had and brought in players. Because that's another thing every Korean team has hanging over their head in Overwatch League is, you look around the league, I did a video on this about all the players helping everyone in the fucking Overwatch League. It's all Koreans. You could have had first pick of every one of these players. They are instantly going to the Lunatic-Hai core. They're immediately going to a team that's actually very good in London Spirit. They'd snap your hands off at this one. And then finally is that issue, which is, I actually get why it made sense to this team to sell Fisher, because let's face it, unless he gets some like horrific injury, you're not going to put him in Overwatch. It's just probably not going to happen. At best, you'd maybe do it every now and then, in like a bizarre Pine style scenario where you just want to play him in this one game against a team that you can get away with. But it definitely hurts to sell him and then have him become a core member of somebody who then is a rival of yours. And unfortunately, that's where I think, this is one of the things I found fascinating about Overwatch League, is it's been an experiment like nothing we've ever seen before, because we haven't had a league that had the same roster fixtures, but then meta switches, and then aspects where players are falling off and you need to literally put them in and out of the lineup. And so, because everyone's been working with like limited understanding of what to do, we're basically figuring out as we go. I can tell that what happened was Jack from Cloud9 thought to himself, I fucking nailed it. You know what? I've only gone and got the team where, oh, what's that core? I got the GC.Busan core. Oh, look, and they've won in clutch fashion over the, like, right, this is cool. Tell you what, forget that two squad things. I've got my squad. This is the main squad. And, we'll use the others every now and then. But you know what? I'm not going to use this tank guy anyway. So why don't I win stage 1 and sell one of the best tanks in the league? You know what? Joke's on everyone else. I'm only going to sell him to one of the worst squads. And then, you know what? I've got the best team, at least until we win the championship. They can have the standings. Who gives a fuck? I've got the best team. I've just made a killing on this player who's worth loads right now, probably his peak value. And also, I don't need him anyway, and, I just make out like a bandit. So at the time, you thought it was the ideal scenario, but it actually, unfortunately, is symptomatic of what's fucked you, which is that you had all this talent. It's taken you forever to figure out which ones you want to keep. You don't really want to sell any that are still good, because actually it doesn't seem like a good strategy. And when you sell them, you can't do the inter-scrim practice, which everyone's been raving about. So, unfortunately, this one feels like mismanagement. It feels like it's one of the biggest factors for this one.
I mean, also the fact that if you are making fat bank on both Rascal and Fisher, why not? Even if I'm upset about Architect, the thing I'm more upset about is actually not giving Krusty a blank check, because the guy has expressed the willingness to want to switch teams, which is proven by him joining the San Francisco Shock. So, like, even if it's not about money, why not just give him the reins then, right? So, I don't know, like the members GC.Busan has is still probably pound for pound at least the second best team in Overwatch League, and it's a team that went, I think, 4-6 last stage. That's not good when going into playoffs. So even now you have a month to rectify or fix these problems. So why not bring in someone that actually has like a proven track record in that? And yes, so you're definitely not getting the coaching staff of NYXL. You're not getting Coach Moon. The other name is Krusty in the Overwatch League right now, or even get help from outside. So, for instance, the Element Mystic coach for at least Element Mystic has been pretty influential on the Overwatch League meta as well, and on Overwatch how it's played, especially around Orisa as well. So he seems to know a thing about strategy, or get the guy that knows something about strategy in that team and try that out for players, because completely leaving that unchanged, unless there's something you can clearly identify behind the scenes that it's the problem. And I guess they made some drastic changes in releasing these players, but they look probably the most mismanaged, not mismanaged, but miscoached team in the Overwatch League based on the talent they have for me.
Yeah. And one of the other factors that makes it hard to blame them, especially early on, definitely I think you can by the time you get towards like the final signing date when they still haven't signed any new players and they're still working with the same squad, is like initially it looked like the gamble had worked just because you had Birdring and Prophet in the same team and they were both just going ham early on. It was looking fantastic. Then you had all this surplus of amazing tanks. So at that point in time, you're thinking, I've got this nailed, you know, now I just have to figure out the last few pieces. And sadly, even that's sort of become a problem towards the end.
There were things also in that season. I mean, yes, if you have located that this is your best lineup with Birdring and Bedosin in, why not play that actually? There were so many matches where they were playing that their second lineup only to go 0-2, and then you bring in out the A-core, and yes, at that point, every team in Overwatch League doesn't have a 100% win rate against every opponent. So if you have to win 3 in a row, it's very, very likely that your main roster will also drop one map. That's basically also led me to say that they were sandbagging. I think it was, in hindsight, maybe it was sandbagging or it was just player maintenance, where these guys were so, because they couldn't in-house scrim anymore. Maybe they wanted some stage time also for their careers, and it was just something to keep the spirits up within the team, to slot them in, or to potentially develop some depth. It didn't work. Hagopyeon and Huyal to an extent was a better player, but Hureg, I don't know. Hureg is almost like an Eska type player, where I'm not sure he brings the intangibles as well. So I don't know what that deal was, but I think that also hampered them incredibly, because you're then taking away valuable experience from that top lineup that you want to play, especially not playing the Bedosin is very problematic for me. I think they should have just kept to that roster, developed certain players to be specialists for maps where you can then bring them in. For instance, if you know you want to play Pharaoh on Nepal a little bit, then yes, you can, for instance, bring in Hureg there. But other than that, I don't think they should have done it much differently than NYXL does if they weren't going to have the 12-player roster.
Because in the context of this being one of the great teams that died off, I do have to say one of the factors, like I alluded to before, that makes the GC.Busan one a bit of a killer is that this doesn't feel like they died off the way the other squads did, because they basically just got rammed into a different team. Like, that's the big problem, if we're being honest. It sounded like, right, we've got these two teams and we're just going to pick the best team. You didn't really. What you did is you played each team separately and then just said, right, how many of the GC.Busan players can we put on this Panthera team that we've decided is better? And that's basically what they did. And like for good or for ill, that has been the approach they've generally taken, and the others have just been subbed in. So to me, what I really wish we could have seen is what would have happened if GC.Busan had just joined a franchise. If they'd have been the Florida Mayhem or something, and it was just the entire squad. Because I feel like both squads actually might have ended up in a better place, because you would have both seen holes in your team way earlier. Like, for example, Profit and Gesture are not just going to carry the entire Overwatch League on their own with the players we just referenced. Hureg still in there. I mean, you think it's like, I think Huyal was only half decent when he first came in the Overwatch. They had some weak spots. And obviously, if you start with that team, you actually have chances to add in players who are quality players who go to all these positions. Whereas instead, it feels like GC.Busan died out without being given a proper kind of like, they didn't get to go out on their own terms,
Yes, and that's sort of sad because, again, they had the Apex Season 4 win, then they had the, not Nexus Cup, but...
It was like Korea Cup or something, right?
Yeah, some bigger turn. Yeah, Seoul Cup, where they also won there against a couple of big teams, then won Stage 1, though with a different core, but at the time I think they also were playing GC.Busan at times, even though it's probably not fair to attribute that win to them. But yeah, the Royal Road, it's almost like they didn't like crash and burn. The road just was sanded over or whatever. Like you just lost track of it because the way this roster was disassembled. So I agree that it would have, not only as a narrative, but also as these teams ended up, and also individual players. For instance, I think that if KDP had remained a unit, I think, for instance, we would think much differently of a player like Rascal now than we do.
Yes.
Because of his performance in Dallas Fuel. So I know that. At the same time, I can't blame Jack, because the idea behind it is actually so baller to just say, yeah, well, I'll just buy the two best looking
for sure, yeah.
teams.
If you're an owner, that is the best move you can do. I'll give you the best example, okay? When at the moment everyone cries about the fact that the Golden State Warriors have the best basketball team, right? The way they all cry is like, oh, they ruined basketball, and what they do is they blame like the individual player, and they blame the org, and they blame the state of basketball that this can happen. But the one part I've never understood is, yes, you can definitely say to the star player who joins their team, you know what, right? Here's the thing. I realize as a star player, you should try and join the best team you can. But if you join a team that has other star players and was already considered amazing, people are going to sort of knock some points off your historical score, as it were. They're going to say, right, you had a lot of help. And that will obviously always be a factor against you in a big discussion. But even then, it's still hard to say to the player, so choose an inferior team to join, right? He's not probably going to want to do that. But forget saying that to the org. I don't even get the people who say that. Like, anyone who says to me that, like, the general manager of the Golden State Warriors is fucking up by making a team that is objectively too good. Remember, he doesn't give a shit who was the star player. He just cares that he gets the trophy. And if he gets the trophy, he might not have been the best GM because he might have had more resources, who knows, but he's done one of the best jobs objectively, so you can't argue against that. So the thing is, from an org perspective, Jack absolutely won the fucking off-season. Somehow, he came in, and despite the fact, hearing about what Seoul Dynasty was doing, this guy came in and stole the entire off-season. He also cock-blocked a bunch of EU players, but we'll just put that to one side. And so, yeah, he killed it, but unfortunately, it turns out GMs don't win Overwatch games.
No, they certainly don't. I mean, there's one more way to, I think, for future managers, there's a couple of ways where you can win that in signing, probably, even though they flanked out or had an upset. I think, for instance, getting a lot of the core of Element Mystic, even though some of them are underage, but I think at least Daco and Pokpo are of age, and then also the backline is probably too. So other than DPS players, if you can sign them, that's already pretty good. Then somehow someone needs to tame Runaway as a unit, and I think the stories before Overwatch League were that Runaway were not willing to sign with a team unless they were able to go in full.
Yes.
No, the thing is, this roster actually has been ever changing. If you think about it, like the first finals roster is only comparable in a couple of players to the Apex Season 4 roster, right? So there is something in that organization, and it might be runner or whatever, how it's run, like that produces champions, even when the players change or the circumstances change. If you can capture that as a GM, that's also a huge win for me. That's basically, and then also looking towards contenders that's happening now. Obviously, one super team that has been created is NYXL2. Sure. At least it looks like one with the former GC.Busan players. If you can harness those spirits and sign them for your organization, I think that's your way to win the off season this time, like Jack did for Overwatch League Season 1.
Sure. Because that's the thing, even though the Fisher storyline's a sexy one, because first of all, he makes it himself, like he's the one promoting that narrative still, you know. I mean, if it didn't bother him, he'd just never bring it up, would he? He'd just be like, oh, cool, I'm in another team, what's the problem, you know? It clearly is something where he wants the validation of getting revenge. But the problem is it doesn't really, like of all the things you can criticise Spitfire for, letting go of a player you weren't going to play. Like, here's the thing, I mean, I guess you could be cynical and say you keep him on the bench forever until his fucking contract runs out, but at the same time, you did objectively try to make the most money while selling him to the least threatening squad at the time, a team that looked like it was going nowhere. It's not like you sold him to the Seoul Dynasty and they're just smashing your head in, you know? So I don't blame them on any of those particular respects. That move actually did make sense. It'd be very different if you'd have sold someone who you just thought was purely surplus as a reply, like you had some decent DPS player, or you had some, like, okay, here's an example. Say NYXL was like, you know what, remember the first stage? They were like, actually, we're an amazing team without Libro. He doesn't really add that much, you know, we just use him sometimes. Or Pine, you know, similar. We don't really need these players. We'll still be the best without them. If they'd have sold those players and then they became like the starting player of the LA Valiant and were kicking your head in, then you could say, you know, maybe it was a bad move. I don't think the Fisher one actually adds up. It's just a fun storyline. It's not really an accurate diss on them, I don't think.
No. That and also they were fairly, I mean, somewhat strategical because they weren't willing to sell both Rascal and Fisher to the same team.
Yes.
Because they knew they already had some synergy because of their time in KDP, right? So, I mean, at this point, unless you can make either Shanghai, where Fisher probably doesn't want to go at that point, or Florida Mayhem pay out huge. I mean, also reportedly, the Gladiators players aren't having the worst salaries in the Overwatch League.
Sure.
At the time, they were, I think, 9th place, I believe. I think they signed him to the team where it looked to be the least lethal. And I could argue, for instance, let's think of a different universe where Dallas Fuel lets go of XQC more quickly and they can actually get Fisher. I'm not sure that season looks that bad. I'm pretty sure that maybe I mean, it's hard to say how his personality, because the other players, I mean, a Taimo is not comparable to a Hydration. I guess we can say that from their oversight appearances, right? But I think that could have also really improved their season if you have a clear guidance. And then also what Fisher actually does is he also focused support play, which is heal me. And then I'll do sick stuff and we win most of those games. And now it actually has branched out where it seems like these other players that, like a Shorefall, for instance, says, oh, I'm not the best player on my team anymore. Let's shape up and actually become a pretty good player in the Overwatch League. And now they're looking actually pretty good.
This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, and a special thanks to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to get teasers for my upcoming work? Find out who's coming next, what topics are being discussed? Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to appear on one of my shows or in one of my videos? Would you like to ask a question in my monthly Patreon AMA, or perhaps even discuss esports as part of a discussion show I run on a monthly basis? Donators can also discuss the topics expounded upon in my videos with me and the other patrons on our Patreon page. All of this and more at the Patreon link below.